let them eat cake. Marie Antoinette probably never said this. But the fact that everyone believed she did tells you everything about the French Revolution. This is the story of how a revolution for liberty invented the most efficient killing machine in history, then used it on everyone, including the revolutionaries themselves. It's also a warning, and Americans should pay attention. France, 1789. The country is bankrupt. The king has spent fortunes on wars and palaces. The queen throws lavish parties while peasants starve in the streets. The French people abhor their rulers. From the Latin abhorrere, meaning to shrink back in horror, abhor describes a visceral rejection. You don't just dislike what you abhor, you recoil from it. This root gives us horror itself, horrify. To cause horror, horrid, causing horror, and abhorrent, deserving of hatred. The people abhorred the aristocracy, and they had reason. Bread prices had doubled. The winter of 1788 was brutal. People were literally dying of hunger, while the nobility debated which wigs were fashionable. King Louis XVI seemed docile, easily led by advisors who cared more about tradition than survival. But docile doesn't mean wise. Louis couldn't read the room. When advisors admonished him about the growing unrest, warning him to act, he hesitated. Those admonishments went unheeded. The king believed in his divine right to rule. How could the people truly challenge God's chosen monarch? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something unprecedented had just happened. America had won its revolution. The American Revolution proved that ordinary people could overthrow a king and build something new. French soldiers had fought alongside Washington. They'd seen it work. One of those soldiers was the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a French aristocrat who'd helped America win its independence. He was friends with Washington, Jefferson, and the founders. He believed in liberty. Now he wanted to bring those ideals home. The Americans had declared that all men are created equal. The French would write their own Declaration of the Rights of Man. Jefferson himself helped draft it. The rhetoric was inspiring: liberty, equality, fraternity. But here's what Americans didn't understand. Their revolution had been relatively controlled. The French Revolution would be something else entirely. On July 14, 1789, a mob stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison that symbolized royal tyranny. In reality, it held only 7 prisoners that day. But symbols matter. The crowd tore it apart. They killed the guards. They paraded severed heads through the streets. This was the first sign that French wrath would not be easily contained. The revolution had begun, and at first, it seemed like it might work. The National Assembly formed. They abolished feudalism. They wrote a constitution. They tried to create a constitutional monarchy, like Britain, with the king as a figurehead. Lafayette commanded the National Guard. He tried to sustain order while pushing for reform, but sustaining a moderate revolution proved impossible. The forces unleashed were too formidable. Here's the problem with revolutions. Once you tell people they have power, they want to use it. And different groups wanted different things. Some wanted reform. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted to undermine everything and start over completely. The radicals began to undermine the moderates, and the moderates couldn't stop them. Wily politicians saw opportunity in chaos. The most wily of all was a lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre. Remember that name? Robespierre was eloquent. He spoke beautifully about virtue and the rights of man. He seemed pure, incorruptible. But his vision of virtue would soon become everyone's nightmare. Meanwhile, the king made a fatal mistake. In 1791, Louis XVI tried to flee France with his family. They were caught at Varennes, dragged back to Paris in humiliation. The king had tried to abandon his people. Now, no one trusted him. Those who'd wanted to keep a constitutional monarchy felt betrayed. Those who'd wanted a republic felt vindicated. The moderates lost all leverage. The revolution's leaders faced a question. What do you do with a king who tried to run? Some said exile him. Some said imprison him. The radicals said there was only one answer. They would justify the king's death as necessary for liberty. The rhetoric shifted from reform to revenge. Louis was no longer a misguided ruler. He was a traitor. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. The crowd cheered. They dipped handkerchiefs in his blood as souvenirs. Marie Antoinette would follow 9 months later. By then, the revolution had become something none of its founders intended. The monarchy was dead, but so was any hope of a moderate republic, because the people who killed the king weren't satisfied. They saw enemies everywhere. The revolution's own children began to devour each other. The early leaders, the ones who'd talked about liberty and rights, found themselves accused of being insolent traitors. The accusation was enough. The same men who'd stormed the Bastille would soon face the guillotine themselves. And this is where the French Revolution becomes a warning for Americans. We had a revolution too. Ours worked out differently. Why? Because in France, the promise of liberty became vacuous, hollow, and empty as fear replaced hope. The vacuous slogans remained: liberty, equality, fraternity. But the words meant nothing when anyone could be arrested for insufficient enthusiasm. In Part 2, we enter the Reign of Terror. 40,000 dead. A revolutionary leader who executed his own allies. And the darkest lesson of all: sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. The guillotine is waiting. 15 words. Lock them in. Abhor, to regard with disgust and hatred. From Latin, to shrink back in horror. Docile, ready to accept control, submissive. Admonish, to warn or reprimand firmly. Sustain, to maintain or support over time. Undermine, to weaken gradually, to erode the base. Wily, skilled at gaining advantage through cunning. Justify, to show or prove to be right. Insolent, showing rude disrespect. Vacuous, empty, lacking substance. +6 you already know. Unprecedented, formidable, eloquent, rhetoric, wrath, and something the revolution wanted but couldn't sustain. Something unprecedented. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and then the terror. Welcome back. In Part 1, we watched the French Revolution begin with hope and end with the king's severed head. Now we enter the terror. 1793. The revolution had killed the king. But killing one man wasn't enough. The radicals saw enemies everywhere. Maximilien Robespierre rose to power. He led the Committee of Public Safety, a name that would become relentless irony. Robespierre believed he was saving France. He was tenacious in his vision of a republic of virtue, a nation purified of corruption. But his definition of corruption kept expanding. Anyone who questioned the revolution was a traitor. Anyone who wasn't enthusiastic enough was suspect. Anyone who had been rich, or knew someone rich, or defended someone rich, could be arrested. The revolutionary tribunals were wanton in their judgments. Wanton describes actions that are reckless, cruel, or excessive without cause. The terror was wanton in every sense. The prisons filled. The guillotine worked overtime. And no one was safe. Not even the original revolutionaries. Here's the darkest part. The men who started the revolution became its victims. The Girondins, moderates who'd helped overthrow the king, were arrested. Robespierre vilified them as secret royalists. To vilify means to destroy someone's reputation through hostile accusations. During the terror, being vilified meant death. The trials were a farce. The accused had no real defense. The verdict was predetermined. Georges Danton, one of the revolution's greatest orators, tried to defend himself. He was too eloquent. They gagged him. Danton went to the guillotine in April 1794. His last words, "Show my head to the people, it is well worth seeing." Robespierre showed no remorse for killing his former allies. Remorse is the pain that gnaws at your conscience. But Robespierre felt none. He believed he was incorruptible. He believed virtue required blood. This is what made him terrifying. He was a sanctimonious idealist who believed murder was moral. Sanctimonious people convince themselves their cruelty is righteousness. They don't condone evil. They redefine it as good. The terror killed approximately 17,000 by official execution, perhaps 40,000 total, in 10 months. The victims weren't just aristocrats. They were priests, peasants, lawyers, shopkeepers. A 15-year-old was executed for cutting down a tree. The charges were often perfidious lies. Perfidious describes betrayal disguised as loyalty. The revolution accused its victims of perfidy while practicing it. Anyone who spoke against the terror was called timorous, accused of fearing virtue. But what Robespierre called timidity was actually sanity. The few who dared to upbraid the committee were marked for death. The American founders watched in horror. Thomas Jefferson had been sympathetic to the revolution, but even he couldn't condone this. John Adams saw it as proof that pure democracy was dangerous. Without checks and balances, the people's will could become the people's fury. This is why our Constitution has 3 branches. This is why we have the Bill of Rights. They built safeguards against this kind of turpitude. Turpitude describes moral corruption at its worst. The terror was an exercise in systematic turpitude masquerading as justice. But revolutions have a logic of their own, and inevitably, the terror would consume Robespierre himself. By summer 1794, Robespierre had eliminated so many rivals that those remaining realized something. They might be next. On July 27, 1794, the convention turned on him. They shouted him down. They refused to let him speak. The man who had silenced Danton was now silenced himself. Robespierre tried to flee. He was shot in the jaw. Either way, the antagonist of liberty was captured. The next day, without trial, Robespierre went to the guillotine. He was 36 years old. He had precipitated the deaths of thousands. Precipitate means to trigger something sudden and dramatic. Robespierre precipitated his own downfall by making everyone fear they were next. The terror was over, but France was shattered. What came next? More chaos. A corrupt government called the Directory. Then a military dictator rose to power. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon would crown himself emperor. The revolution that killed a king would create an emperor. The irony was complete. But that's another story. So what does this mean for Americans? Our revolution succeeded where France's failed because our founders were vindictive against tyranny, but not against each other. They disagreed violently. Hamilton and Jefferson despised each other, but they didn't execute each other. They built institutions that could survive their disagreements. France didn't have that. Their revolution became a purity test. Anyone insufficiently revolutionary was an enemy. That's the warning. When political opponents become enemies. When disagreement becomes treason. When we stop arguing and start purging. That's when a revolution for liberty becomes a terror. The French revolutionaries started with liberty, equality, fraternity. They ended with be pure or die. The blade doesn't care about your principles. Once it starts falling, it's very hard to stop. Don't let it happen here. Word recap. Let's lock in all 30 words from this episode. From Part 1, abhor, docile, admonish, sustain, undermine, wily, justify, insolent, vacuous. From Part 2, wanton, vilify, remorseful, sanctimonious, condone, perfidious, timorous, upbraid, turpitude, precipitate, plus your review words, relentless, tenacious, eloquent, inevitable, vindictive, and antagonist. 30 words, 1 revolution, and a warning that democracy requires eternal vigilance. If this helped you think about history differently, subscribe. New episode every week. Liberty, equality, fraternity, but also balance, restraint, and the rule of law.